You know, we're all swimming in these massive, complex financial systems, and most of the time, they're pretty much invisible to us. But today, we're going to step inside. We're going to look at the systems built to handle our biggest, deepest fears about the future. We're cracking open the world of insurance and pensions to see exactly how they tick.
I mean, really think about that for a second. These aren't just abstract ideas, right? They're the kind of personal anxieties that can genuinely keep you up at night. How can any one person plan for a future that's so fundamentally unpredictable? Well, it turns out there's a multi-trillion-dollar industry built specifically to answer that very question.
So, where does this all begin? Well, it starts with two colossal risks that every single one of us has to deal with, and understanding these two is really the key to unlocking this entire system.
First up, you've got longevity risk. Now, living a long, healthy life is obviously the goal for all of us, but financially, it's a huge challenge. How do you make a pot of money that you've saved up last for an unknown number of years? That fundamental uncertainty, the risk of your income drying up while you're still alive, that's what the industry calls longevity risk.
And then there's the other big one, an equally powerful threat, investment risk. This is the danger that all the savings you've so carefully built up over decades could get hammered by forces completely outside of your control. We've all seen the scary headlines about market crashes. That volatility is a constant threat to anyone trying to build a secure future.
Okay, so you've got these two huge, potentially life-altering risks hanging over your head. Trying to manage them all by yourself is, well, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible. But what if you didn't have to? This brings us to the foundational magic trick of the entire financial safety net.
The whole system, and I mean the entire thing, is built on this one simple but really powerful idea: risk transfer. As an individual, you can essentially hand over these giant personal worries, longevity and investment risk, to an insurance company or a pension provider. These are institutions specifically designed to manage these exact risks, but on a massive scale. So how does it actually work? On the surface, it looks pretty straightforward. You're the one facing the risks. You pay a fee, which we all know is a premium, and in exchange for that premium, the insurer steps in and guarantees an outcome, like a steady income for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live or what the market does. They are now carrying that burden for you.
All right, let's hit pause for a second and think like an actuary. Here's a real question from a past paper, and it gets right to the heart of how these providers have to think. It's not just about taking on risk, it's about pricing it with incredible precision. So for a product like this, which actually pays out more if someone is expected to have a shorter life, what external factors would you need to think about to set the price? Things like interest rates, the latest medical advances, even what your competitors are doing. It just shows you the incredibly complex math that's going on behind that simple premium.
So whenever you've got an industry managing trillions of dollars and making promises that won't pay out for like 50 years, you absolutely need a strong rule book. You need a referee on the field to make sure the game is being played fairly for everyone involved.
And here's the main reason why regulation is so crucial. It comes down to what's called information asymmetry, which is really just a fancy way of saying there's a huge knowledge gap. On one side, you have the provider with teams of experts, actuaries, lawyers, and massive resources. On the other side, you have the average person just trying to navigate a world of really complex and often confusing choices. Regulators exist to bridge that gap.
Okay, so what do these regulators actually do? Well, you can think of them as having a few different jobs. First, they're the gatekeepers, deciding who even gets to play in this market. Then, they're supervisors, constantly watching over how these companies are being run. They're also the enforcers, with the power to investigate and punish anyone who breaks the rules. And crucially, they also work to educate consumers, helping to close that knowledge gap we were just talking about.
All right, let's flip the script. We've talked about you handing over your risk. But what happens on the other side? What does it look like from the insurer's point of view? Because once they accept your risk, they're now facing a whole new set of monumental challenges.
This is where the scale just gets wow. It's kind of mind-boggling. The insurer isn't just holding your individual risk anymore. They've taken it and pooled it with the risks of millions of other people. They're now holding this massive, concentrated portfolio of promises that they are legally and financially on the hook to keep, sometimes 50, 60, or even 70 years from now.
Which leads to the absolute million-dollar or really trillion-dollar question for any of these providers. How on earth do you manage your money today to absolutely guarantee you can meet a specific promise in the distant future through all the booms and busts the economy is definitely going to go through? The answer lies in a core discipline of the industry.
And that answer is a discipline called asset liability management. You'll hear it called ALM, and it is the absolute bedrock of how these institutions stay in business and keep their promises. Think of it as a constant, high-stakes balancing act. On one side, you have their assets, all the investments the company owns. On the other side, you have their liabilities, all the promises they've made to customers. The entire science of ALM is about making sure that asset side can always, and I mean always, cover the liability side as those payments start coming due.
But here's the thing. It's not just one big pile of promises. A huge piece of the ALM puzzle is figuring out exactly what kind of promise you've made. Is it a fixed dollar amount? Is it tied to inflation? Is there some wiggle room, like a discretionary bonus? Or is the payout directly linked to how well your investments do? Each one of these demands a completely different investment strategy. You know, you'd match a fixed, guaranteed promise with a super stable bond, but a promise that's linked to the market, that requires a totally different approach to your assets.
Okay, so ALM handles that core financial balancing act. But these companies are huge, right? They face all sorts of other threats, everything from operational meltdowns to cyber attacks to scandals that could damage their reputation. To handle all of that, they need an even broader, more holistic way of seeing and managing danger.
And that's where enterprise risk management, or ERM, comes in. The really game-changing idea with ERM is to stop looking at risks in their own little silos. Before ERM, the investment team might not fully understand a risk that the legal team has spotted. ERM is all about seeing the entire chessboard, understanding how a legal risk might trigger a market risk, which could create a dangerous domino effect. It's about spotting those hidden connections and concentrations of risk.
And this isn't something you just do once and forget about. It's a constant cycle, a loop that never stops. You identify every possible risk you can think of, you classify them, you try to measure their potential impact, you figure out how to control them, and then you monitor everything all the time. And that monitoring feeds right back into identifying new and changing risks. It's a process that truly never ends.
Now, a really key part of this whole ERM process is knowing the difference between what you can control and what you can't. Diversifiable risk is basically the danger of a single company or a single industry having a bad year. You can manage that by spreading your investments around. But systematic risk, that's the risk of the entire market going down, you can't diversify that away. ERM helps a company understand exactly how much exposure it has to both types and plan for the worst. All right, we have covered a ton of ground here, right? We've gone from our own personal fears about the future all the way up to the complex strategies of these huge financial institutions. So let's bring it all back home and distill it down to the core ideas you should take away from all this.
So if you're going to remember anything, let it be these 4 big ideas. They're like the pillars holding this whole thing up. First, risk transfer. That's the whole foundation, how you hand your worries to an expert. Second, regulation. That's the essential safeguard for all of us. Third, asset liability management, ALM. That's the provider's detailed playbook for keeping those long-term promises. And fourth, enterprise risk management, ERM. That's their grand, holistic strategy for survival and growth. These 4 concepts are really the engine room of the entire system. And to wrap it up, let's look at one final question from a past paper, because this one really ties everything we've talked about together. A defined benefit pension scheme makes a very specific, guaranteed promise about your retirement income. So to set its investment strategy, you'd have to use every single concept we've discussed, analyzing the specific liabilities, applying strict ALM principles, understanding how much risk the scheme can tolerate, and doing it all within the regulatory rules. It's the ultimate real-world application of this whole framework.
You know, at the end of the day, all of this, all the complex models, the regulations, the strategies, it all really boils down to one simple fundamental goal: managing the company well enough to meet the promises that you've made to people who are depending on you.
So we've built this incredible, really sophisticated system to manage all the risks that we can see and predict. But that leaves us with one final, and maybe the most important question to think about. What's the biggest unknown risk out there on the horizon? The one we haven't planned for yet, that could challenge this whole structure in a completely new way? That's something to chew on. Thanks for tuning in.